One of the great pleasures I have as an academic is introducing friends who are giving seminars or giving talks, in part because they never know what I'm going to say, and it creates just a little bit of anxiety in friends. But when I was hired at BYU, I hadn't been here a week before. 4 or 5 times people had said, "Do you know George Handley?" And they said, "You're interested in the environment. This is somebody on campus you need to know." And it's been amazing. I've been here at BYU for about 7 years, and it was within weeks of being hired that I sought out George and realized that he was a major force on campus for creating a conversation about the environment. And through interactions over the previous several years, sort of the culmination of all of that has been this seminar series. We ought to celebrate our faculty members. George spent his academic time in the Bay Area. He did his undergrad at Stanford and got a master's and PhD at Berkeley. He's done all sorts of amazing scholarly work from post-slavery literatures and New World poetics, right? So sort of really embedded within the humanities, but also has been really important in public conversations, editing books, including one on stewardship and the creation with LDS thought on stewardship. In the last few years, he wrote an amazing memoir on home waters, which is a compilation of creative nonfiction and memoir and other things as well. All while he's also the chair of his department, and he bikes and he does all these other things, and he's so energetic, and it's his energy that I think was the activation energy required to move a lot of what's happened in the Environmental Ethics Initiative forward. And so I'm thrilled that he's willing to speak to us today, and I'm looking forward to what he has to say. So thanks, George.
Well, thank you, Rick. Especially Rick is agreed to sort of oversee the management of this whole series. So I think we all owe him a round of applause for this great semester that you've had. And I want to encourage all of you, if you've been, especially for those of you who've been part of this seminar all semester, that all of the lectures have been posted on the Kennedy Center website. So you should be sharing them widely with your friends and family members, your proverbial uncle that Catherine Hayhoe referred to, anybody who you think would benefit from hearing more about this conversation. We're so glad that that's been archived the way it has. And we want to thank the Kennedy Center and the Nature Conservancy also for helping us co-sponsor this and make this happen. My presentation today is going to build on some of the ideas that Catherine Hayhoe already presented to you, and I think it's going to dig a little more deeply into specifically LDS values to help us understand why we should care especially about climate change, and I think looking at those values to help us guide ourselves in our efforts to try to make a difference. And one of the most important concepts that she introduced was the ways in which political ideology and theology interface and sometimes interfere with one another. I was rather disconcerted to learn that political ideology was becoming more important of an indicator of an appropriate spouse than shared religious values, but that's the way it is, I guess. But it's not the way it has to be, and some of that will depend on us. The interesting truth is that for many decades now, people have been arguing that religion really is a solution, a potential solution to environmental problems, and certainly specifically for climate change. And that has to do with how we think about ethics and what it is that shapes our ethics. I start with a quote from Aldo Leopold, who said that we can only be ethical in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love, or otherwise have faith in. Leopold was the great mid-20th century conservationist whose Sand County Almanac is required reading for anybody concerned with the environment. And this is a really interesting phrase, right? It tells us that, and what he argued in his book, of course, was for a land ethic. He said, we're not going to be ethical towards animals and plants unless we can see, feel, understand, love, or otherwise have faith in them. They have to have some kind of meaning to us, some kind of presence for us to care and then begin to act on behalf of the larger biotic community. So it then becomes an interesting question: what will it take to stimulate that kind of seeing, feeling, understanding, loving, and having faith in the natural world in order to care? I suppose one helpful way would be to go to a stream bed with Riley Nelson and get him talking about bugs, and that will be contagious enough for you that you will care about bugs in a way you never thought you could. That certainly, so learning and educating ourselves in biology and ecology and the earth sciences is certainly a vital step in that direction. But religion can also be very useful to us, right? Because religion shapes the way we understand the creation and our human responsibility to it in a moral context with a very powerful and persuasive narrative that sticks with people, presumably believers, obviously, over the course of their lifetime. And so in 1967, the great medieval historian Lynn White had this to say. He said, "What we do about ecology depends on our ideas of the sorry, I can barely read mine, and I can see you can barely read yours, so I'm sorry, that should have been in white letters instead of black." But he says, what we do about ecology depends on our ideas of the man-nature relationship. More science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. And specifically what he was arguing was that religion, to the degree that it teaches that physical life has sacred value, that it has spiritual presence for us, then it is more likely to cause us to see, feel, understand, and want to treat the natural world ethically. But to the degree that religion teaches us that all physical life is simply dead matter and it doesn't matter what we do to it, and the better life is the one that's coming after this one, then it may actually hurt. And so that was what he was getting at in his essay. And as it turns out, religion is becoming increasingly irrelevant to the conversation about the environment. Just to give you some idea, we've had an outpouring of literature over the past many decades now, especially since Lynn White's essay, in a field that's now called eco-theology, and it's a field that looks at the relationship between religious values and environmental attitudes and behavior, and argues that every religious tradition has something important to bring to the conversation, and that every religious tradition ought to dig into its own core values and beliefs in order to explore its environmental values and probably give them more attention than they have received, because in virtually every religious tradition, these values have not always been given the attention that they need. And this is great reading, by the way. I mean, it's very interesting for religious-minded people. It's interesting for academics who don't have particular religious beliefs. But for you, it might be very important to dig into some of this kind of reading and to learn what different theologians in the Christian tradition and in other religious traditions are saying. Because one of the things I think you'll find is that it resonates, a lot of that literature resonates very interestingly with Mormon beliefs. But eco-theology isn't just an academic field, it's also a field of activism. There are many, many organizations that stem from sectarian institutions or as interfaith organizations that are devoted to caring for the environment, doing something about climate change, about species extinctions, and so on. Catherine Hayhoe mentioned the Evangelical Environmental Network. There's Green Faith, which is an interfaith organization. There's Interfaith Power and Light. I'll talk a little bit more about them later. There's the Council for the Environment and Jewish Life. There's many other similar kinds of organizations among Muslims and among various Christian traditions. And, of course, many religious leaders, the Patriarch Bartholomew of the Orthodox Church, who oversees over 200 million Orthodox Christians, and Pope Francis are both very, very active right now on this front. And, in fact, the Pope is about to release an encyclical on the environment that many people are predicting is really going to be a major sea change for Catholics, especially with regard to his concern about climate change in particular. So it's not a, there's also the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, which is based in the United Kingdom, that was actually begun by Prince Charles and is worldwide. There is an academic organization at Yale University called the Forum on Religion and Ecology that has actually sponsored a lot of these academic conversations, but also reaches out into the public sphere in some very effective and important ways. What I want to convey to you very briefly in just these a couple of slides is just how vibrant and active religious communities are in environmental stewardship. And this has been a development that many consider one of the most important developments in religion worldwide in recent years. So with all this going on, it does beg the question, what might we as Mormons have to contribute, and what our core beliefs might be that pertain to the stewardship of the environment generally and to climate change in particular. And I'm going to try to give you a very rushed, brief overview of what I consider to be some of the most important doctrinal principles, and then I want to look at sort of how we might think about applying them. Well, before I show you that slide, I want you to remember a couple of significant facts about our understanding of the creation. Joseph Smith restored 3 accounts of the creation. In the book of Moses, and the book of Abraham, and the temple endowment ceremony are all 3 slightly distinct but harmonious accounts of the creation, of the story of Adam and Eve and what we find in Genesis, but with some very important and interesting, distinct doctrinal contributions. And it's those doctrinal contributions that I want to touch on briefly. One is what we know to be the fact that the world is created spiritually before it is created physically, right? And we read this verse, and that's a tree in Trinidad, by the way, a saman tree, which is a beautiful tree. Out of the ground made I, the Lord God, to grow every tree naturally that is pleasant to the sight of man, and man could behold it, and it became also a living soul. The scriptures, of course, not only identify plants as living souls, but also animals as living souls. I formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and they were also living souls. Now, the phrase living soul, of course, is what Adam and Eve are described as when they are finally created physically and spiritually. So it's that union of the spirit and the body that makes a living soul that Joseph Smith said was so crucial to our eternal progression. It's also noted in Moses, this is, that's not Moses 1:22, that's Genesis 1:22, and it says, I, God, blessed every living creature that moveth. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the sea and let fowl multiply in the earth. I bring up Genesis because this is consistent with what we understand in the restored accounts of the creation, that not only does God seem to place a lot of value on these living souls all around us, but that he wants them to multiply and replenish, to fill the seas, to fill the air. And we understand from teachings of the prophets that this is because every living soul has a right to joy in its posterity, that this is important to God, that all life flourish, right? And so clearly that is part of what our stewardship entails, is that kind of biodiversity. The other thing, another doctrinal issue that's very interesting certainly in the book of Moses, is that Moses is given a vision of the creation that goes far beyond this earth, right? I mean, unlike Genesis, it's very clear and explicitly stated in the book of Moses that God's creations are far more numerous than just this earth or just this solar system, that they go beyond what Moses was able to account, right? He was not able to count all of God's creations, and the immensity of what he saw was such that it overwhelmed him, and he collapses, right? And when he finally gets up the strength, he gets up and he says, now for this cause I know that man is nothing, which thing I never had supposed. Now that doesn't mean the same thing as man is insignificant, right? He's already been told that he was created in God's image, that God loves him and knows him by name, and his unique human privilege is to understand the immensity of God's creations and understand his own nothingness in relationship to it. That's a unique, exceptional human experience of awe and wonder, right? Which we also can understand as an experience of love, even though it's a interesting way of making us feel diminished and significant at the same time, right? I think that's a really powerful doctrinal principle. The last one that I'll just mention very briefly, and I wish I had more time to go into, is just that is very significant, and that is that God, we learned from the restored creation account of the creation that God did not create the world out of nothing, but out of unorganized matter. And this has very, very important implications, especially for understanding science. What I want to say is this is an account of the creation that's very science-friendly. It's easier to argue for its ability to reconcile itself with science than other accounts of the creation that are much more narrow in their temporal scale, and in their spatial scale, and also in their spiritual understanding. So it's fair to ask what some of these doctrines, I'm going to talk about some more doctrines here in a moment, but just focusing on the creation for a moment, what do these have to do with climate change? Well, for one, we learned that all living things are not living things, but are living souls, and I think it bears, going back to Lynn White's point, what difference does it make to you is a question to pose to yourself, to know that when you're looking at trees and living things and observing animal behavior, you're observing living souls and not just things. I think it certainly teaches the inherent value of all life, and it raises us to have it gives us the challenge of learning how to see through things so that we can see their spiritual value. William Wordsworth was fond of talking about that kind of perception that goes beyond the surface. This is what Joseph F. Smith, a great lover of nature, said: "We have eyes and see not, for that which we cannot appreciate or admire we are largely blind to, no matter how beautiful or inspiring it may be." So even when we're looking at something like Zion, which this is a photo of the great patriarchs, maybe we're not seeing it enough, right? If we're really seeing, we begin to see spiritually. As children of God, it is our duty to appreciate and worship Him in His creations. If we would associate all that is truly good and beautiful in life with thoughts of Him, we would be able to trace His handiwork throughout all nature. That's a really beautiful summary, I think, of how nature is a witness and a gift of Christ, and that purely selfish use of nature or misrecognition of its sacred qualities might be sinful acts. Secondly, I think we learn that, we already know that climate change is affecting biodiversity, and it's affecting biodiversity in at least two general ways. One is that the very acts that we do that contribute to climate change, such as cutting down trees and causing deforestation, cause biodiversity. But climate change, the effects of climate change, that is the warming climate, is itself also affecting biodiversity, right? Because ecosystems that might otherwise be healthy and intact are under stress because the plants and the animals are struggling to adapt in such short time, in such a short time frame to the changes that we're seeing. So if we're concerned about every life form having the opportunity to reproduce and multiply and replenish, certainly climate change ought to concern us as a threat to that web of life. And thirdly, we know that creation, from the accounts that I've just addressed briefly, we know that the creation is complex, we know it's deeply temporal, we know it's fragile, we know it's interconnected, and this makes for a theology, as I say, that's very friendly to science. And I think that means we ought not to be threatened by it. We ought to be comfortable with it, but it also means that God loves us and knows us, even if we can't understand everything, and that we have a special relationship to the creation that consists of awe and wonder. I will note, without going into too much detail, that Satan is interested in disrupting that relationship that Moses has with the creation. Satan shows up right when he has that vision and starts trying to convince Moses, as he did Jesus, and as we understand he did to Adam and Eve, to try to tempt them to use and abuse the earth as something that could give them possessions and power. So the earth is there for us, we're told, but it is not to be exploited, but to be taken good care of. Now, a second major category of doctrinal principle is the principle of stewardship itself, which we might take a little bit too much for granted in our religious tradition. There are no verses anywhere in the Bible quite like D&C 49 and 59, and I'll just briefly read these to you. For behold, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air and that which cometh of the earth and is ordained for the use of man for food and for raiment, that he might have in abundance. But it is not given that one man should possess that which is above another, wherefore the world lieth in sin. And woe unto man that sheddeth blood or that wasteth flesh and hath no need. And I think it's clear as I read this that when we're talking about wastefulness of flesh, that's not just animal flesh, it's the flesh of the earth, right? Everything that has been provided for us is provided for us so that we can distribute things equitably throughout the earth so that everyone has sufficient and so that there is enough for everyone. And whenever, this scripture is pretty clear, whenever there is inequality, the world lies in sin. So what does this have to do with climate change? Well, before I answer that question, I want to read one more, and this is D&C 59. Yea, all things which come of the earth in the season thereof are made for the benefit and the use of man, both to please the eye and to gladden the heart, yea, for food and for raiment, for taste and for smell, to strengthen the body and to enliven the soul. And it pleaseth God that he hath given all these things unto man, for unto this end were they made to be used, with judgment, not to excess, neither by extortion. So those are just two examples, and there's several others in the Doctrine and Covenants that you will not find anywhere in the Bible. And most eco-theologians are sort of wishing that they had scripture that made it that clear, right, that we should be good stewards of God's creations. But we have plenty of such verses in the Doctrine and Covenants. And some of the things we learn from these verses are that aesthetic contemplation of nature is a spiritual value. God wants us to take the time to take pleasure in his creations. And that may be, if D&C 59 is to be believed, it sounds like it's almost a priority before we think about food and clothing. That we ought to take the time, even in Moses 3:9, where it says, "And man could behold the tree," right? Adam, you can just imagine Adam and Eve kind of staring at a tree for the first time and just saying, "What is that? That is beautiful." Or looking at animals and perceiving them as strange and wonderful and beautiful. It also implies that we have to, especially 59, give so much emphasis to the aesthetic experience that it's a sensual experience, right? God wants us to see, feel, touch, smell, experience nature directly, and that has spiritual value for us. So it does seem to behoove us to experience and enjoy and know nature, not to think of it as something in the abstract that we love in the abstract because we have calendar photos of wild lands, and we think that's beautiful, or we have paintings of beautiful landscapes, but we don't actually know or understand or experience in any direct way particular places and particular landscapes. These verses also tell us that consumption matters, right? And we're going to hear more about that in a second, but it matters a great deal to the climate, what we're consuming. Essentially, when we look at carbon emissions and carbon output, because we are a fossil fuel-based economy, every act of consumption that we engage in produces a certain amount of carbon into the atmosphere. And so we can think about consumption as something that can have a direct impact on the environment, either positively or negatively, depending on what our rates of consumption are. And just to remind you that we as 21st century Americans consume more of the Earth's resources than anyone in the history of the world, and certainly more than anyone else in the world right now per capita, by quite a distance. So it's very difficult to argue that the rates of consumption that we're engaging in, some of which, by the way, are not entirely our fault. I mean, some of the inefficiencies in the system are because of a large and complex system. Some of them have to do with our own personal wastefulness. Maybe we're taking very, very long hot showers, or we are using cars much more often than we should, and so on. But sometimes it has to do with just the inefficiencies of an economy that is not built to be efficient environmentally or in terms of energy use. And this is all a very important question, especially when we turn to D&C 104, a scripture that is often cited somewhat out of context, because the phrase that you'll most often hear cited from D&C 104 is the phrase, "there is enough and to spare." And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people who are very opposed to environmental stewardship who will immediately cite that phrase as if that sort of ends the conversation. But if you look carefully at these verses, which I won't take the time to read word for word, but a few phrases jump out that maybe they ought also to be considering. One is, if any man take of the abundance which I have made and impart not his portion according to the law of my gospel unto the poor and the needy, he shall with the wicked lift up his eyes in hell, being in torment. Now, I think there's probably a good reason why we don't like to quote that one very often, because that's a very serious moral warning. That the only reason the Lord, the condition upon which the Lord makes his promise that there is enough and to spare, is that you and I do not waste flesh, we do not shed blood unnecessarily, that what we use of the world's resources we need, and that we learn how to bring our wants and needs closer to one another so that we're not out of balance, and that with the excess that you and I enjoy in such abundance in the 21st century, living at a level that kings and queens 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago could never even have dreamed of, that you and I learn how to find ways to redistribute those resources, to make better use of them so that they bless those who have far less than we do. There are over 1 billion people in the world who do not have access to clean drinking water. And there are, as I heard from a member of the welfare committee of the church, at least 10% of our membership, so I assume that means about 1.5 million members of our church who are in extreme poverty in that same category. So even within our own church, we're not redistributing our own resources very effectively, and certainly worldwide, that's not the case. And the Lord is saying, the world lieth in sin until that problem is solved. How we solve that, of course, is a difficult and important question. But all I'm saying is it doesn't give us the liberty to just shrug our shoulders and say, we got enough and to spare. We don't have to worry, because we are commanded here to worry very much about our own impact and the well-being of others. So, and as I say, this is really central to understanding the impact that we have individually and as a society on the climate, is our consumption levels. Just today I was reading in the Deseret News an editorial by a conservative columnist who was saying that he doesn't think climate change is as big a deal as people think, because he said climate change activists really just want to control population levels. Now, I'm not naive in believing that, I don't want to be naive in believing that all environmentalists, that no environmentalists have such concerns or want to engage in draconian measures like China to control population levels. There certainly are such environmentalists. But for that to be the characterization of the entire concern about climate change that is happening globally, especially coming from people like the Pope, who doesn't believe in birth control, that should tell you something, that one's attitude about reproduction and population levels is not necessarily a predictor of whether or not climate change is real, or it's something that we are causing as human beings, and something therefore that we should worry ourselves about. The real issue in my mind isn't so much population levels, it's consumption levels. And if we want to reserve the right to have the freedom to make reproductive choices, which I very much believe we have the right and obligation to do, and that governments have the obligation to protect such freedoms. If we want those freedoms, I think we also have to recognize the obligation that then puts on us to make sure that we are reproducing in a way that is fair. Not so much in terms of numbers, but what I mean to say is that we are producing families and individuals who are careful, good stewards. Because that will go a lot longer, I think, in affecting change for the better across the globe than whether or not we have 1, 2, or 4, or 6 children. I think it has a lot more to do with what kinds of people we are and what kinds of consumers we become. And one thing that I think is important to understand is that the church has published a very important website on their Gospel Topics page on environmental stewardship and conservation. And so I encourage all of you to go look at that. And on that page, you'll find a speech given by Elder Marcus Nash of the Quorum of the 70. He gave that speech 2 years ago at the University of Utah at a conference on religion and the environment, something along the lines of what we're talking about here. And he was asked to give an official position of the LDS Church on stewardship. So if if you want, this is what I want to suggest to you is this is the most authoritative speech that you can find on what Mormons believe about stewardship, and I encourage all of you to read it. A couple of points that he makes that I want to highlight here is he says, as stewards over the earth and all life thereon, we are to gratefully make use of that which the Lord has provided, avoid wasting life and resources, and use the bounty of the earth to care for the poor. That's a very simple one-sentence definition of an LDS position of stewardship, I think. He also says, the unbridled, voracious consumer is not consistent with God's plan of happiness, which calls for humility, gratitude, and mutual respect. So we, in other words, do not have an excuse to consume at will, but we instead have a mandate to be modest in our consumption. Now, the last and what D&C 104 is really talking about is what we call the law of consecration, right? So we have stewardship doctrines, but we also have even more holistically a law of consecration that is talking about a whole way of life that we ought to adopt that helps all of life to flourish around us. The last one I want to talk about briefly is the Doctrine Covenants 89, the Word of Wisdom, which of course has to do with eating. Now, you might ask yourself, what does eating have to do with climate change? Well, it turns out it has a lot to do with climate change, and you've heard over the course of this semester many different reasons why that might be the case, but a lot of it has to do with the energy that goes into the transportation of food. It has to do with the land use that reduces biodiversity, reduces the Earth's capacity to absorb carbon in the atmosphere because of food production. And what kinds of food we produce and where we produce it and how far we ship it have a lot to do with our impact on the climate. And of course, you know, the one verse that we often almost tease ourselves about for never paying any attention to is in verse 12, which tells us to eat meat sparingly. Now, I'm not here to tell you what to do with that phrase, but I think it's important that we all consider that seriously, because we know that the lower we eat on the food chain, the better it is for the environment and better for the climate. 1 pound of ground beef uses the equivalent of a gallon of gasoline of fossil fuel energy, and it uses it takes the equivalent of over 100 gallons of water to produce 1 ounce of beef. Now, by comparison, that's 10 times more water than is necessary to produce 1 ounce of chicken. So you are actually doing better by eating white meat and fish rather than red meat. And it's over 100 times more water than it takes to grow fruits and vegetables, most fruits and vegetables. Some are exceptional because they require a lot of water, but most of the run-of-the-mill fruits and vegetables we eat are quite a bit less. So water and fossil fuel energy are used up in greater proportion to the degree that you eat higher and higher in the food chain. And it may make sense if you think about the fact that in order to have something like a cattle ranch, you have to have land that can't have trees on it. It's got to be something that can be grazed, so it's not less likely to be absorbing carbon. You have cattle which emit methane, which is actually, is it 15 times more of a greenhouse gas than carbon? Did I get that right? I don't. It's something on that order of much more of a potent greenhouse gas. And then you have to feed all those animals. And so in order to feed all those animals, you have to have fields and fields of grain. In order to grow that grain, you need lots and lots of water, and you got to transport. You can see the problem. It gets more and more complex the higher up the food chain you go. The other thing in verse 11 is interesting to pay attention to. Every herb in the season thereof and every fruit in the season thereof. Those are interesting phrases. A lot of people who are interested in trying to reduce their carbon footprint are trying very hard to eat locally because food transportation is so wasteful, and food packaging is so extraordinarily wasteful. And sitting in your car idling while you're in a fast food drive-through only adds to the waste, right? So every time you and I eat food that's mass reproduced, that's packaged excessively, and that has traveled a great distance, we are increasing by orders of magnitude our carbon footprint and our ecological footprint. So eating fruits and vegetables in season is a really great way of reducing that impact. So being a great supporter of locally grown agriculture, there's community-supported agricultural farms here in Utah Valley. There's a farmer's market, so there's ways in which you and I can help, and we can encourage cities and city planning to protect farmland so that that doesn't disappear and that we end up being more vulnerable to food crises because of the distance that food has to travel. The average meal in America travels 1,300 miles to get to your plate. So it's not just a cool thing to eat locally. I think it is a cool thing, but it makes a big difference. And notice too in verse 14, this is just a little side note, that this is a verse that tells us that God is interested not just in feeding you, He's interested not just in feeding your pets and your domesticated animals on your farm, but He's interested in feeding the wild animals. The D&C 89 is about the great web of life, right? It's about God providing for all living forms, and that there is something connected to our dietary code that connects us and should connect us to the creation. I should mention that D&C 59, which we were looking at just a minute ago, is all about the Sabbath day, and the Sabbath day is established to honor the creation, right? And so when we partake of the Sabbath day, when we refrain from working. By the way, not working and driving on a Sunday is great for the environment. And I always try to point out to people who get a little cynical about Mormons and the climate, I say, you know what, Mormons are not working one day a week, so you should be grateful for that. That's a major thing. So there is something for us to already feel proud of, but it's an important opportunity, I think, in taking the sacrament and fasting and giving alms to the poor is an important way to honor and remember the creation. One last summary statement from Elder Nash. He says, the better we care for this world and all in it, the better it will sustain, inspire, strengthen, enliven, and gladden our hearts and spirits, and prepare us to dwell with our Heavenly Father, with our families in a celestial sphere. This is interesting. Which members of the LDS Church believe will be the very earth upon which we stand today, but in a glorified state. So we are not a religion that is keen on getting out of here. We're keen on staying put. And I think that behooves us to take good care of where we are. So we are to be stewards of the whole earth, right? Because we are connected physically and spiritually to the web of life, and we are to have respect for the inherent worth of all living souls, not just human alone, and to work to ensure all life, human and more than human, to stand a chance to flourish. And the Scriptures tell us that we are accountable to God for how we execute these responsibilities. So then I think the question becomes, why does it appear that we are no better and often worse than the average American in our attitudes about environmental issues? Why is this? I wish I had the easy answer. I will say that in all of the tension that I sometimes see about the environment, especially in places like Utah, that sometimes become a Mormon, non-Mormon kind of conflict, these doctrines have inspired a remarkable number of people in our church throughout our history to be good stewards of the earth. And these are people who are good stewards of the earth, not despite the fact that they're Mormon, but because they're Mormon. And I draw great strength and inspiration from such people. And I wish I could take the time to tell some of those stories. Some of those stories have been told on our LDS Earth Stewardship blog, which I'll highlight in a moment. But there are many more to tell. But it's still a good question. Why are there not more of us? Why are we not leading out? Why are we not even more a part of the conversation that's already happening? And I don't have all the answers to this, but a couple of quick ones that are worth thinking about, and then I want to just talk about theological obstacles for a moment. But it is important to remember that the region that we're in the Intermountain West, is characterized by a lot of strong anti-environmental attitudes, and they are not unique to Mormons. Mormons happen to be predominantly here in many parts of the Intermountain West, but those attitudes are common across all kinds of religious lines. So it doesn't appear to be a causal relationship that if you're Mormon, then you must hate the EPA, right, or the Endangered Species Act. But these things have to do with the history of the settlement of these areas, many of which are predominantly owned by the federal government in the public lands that are part of our state, in Nevada and Idaho and Wyoming and Montana and Arizona and so on and so forth. And so a lot of the attitudes that we find here are common elsewhere. And so they have found their way into church culture pretty predominantly. And there is the problem that Catherine Hayhoe was identifying, and it's a relatively recent problem. It didn't used to be the case that if you were Republican, you were anti-environmental 30 years ago. But it is about 30 years ago or so that change starts to happen, where the two parties really split on several issues, and one of them is the environment. But Richard Nixon is known widely as one of the most environmental presidents we've ever had, and he was, as you know, a Republican. But what I want to talk about briefly are some theological obstacles, what I would call theologies of doubt that sometimes creep in the way we think about the environment. One is pretty common that I tend to hear, especially among youth, and maybe this is sort of just a quickly formed thought that some people have, is that, well, the earth is going to die anyway, so why should we bother taking care of it? I mean, we're in the latter days. There's no way I'm going to save the earth for a longer period of time. What's the point? And that's not unique to Mormons. It's common among most millennial Christians who believe in the second coming. They do tend to sort of adopt that kind of an attitude. The only problem with it is that it's profoundly unethical, right? I mean, if you were to say, my body is also going to die, so why should I bother taking care of it? That idea would offend most any Mormon, certainly, right? And so what I would just simply suggest is that we try to help people think about translating our ethics towards our own body to the body of the earth, because we too are going to die anyway, we're going to resurrect anyway, so why bother? But we recognize that ethical treatment of our body is a way of showing gratitude for the creation. I've already talked about this, but this notion that there is enough and to spare is sort of a general attitude that assumes that therefore we don't have to worry about consumption levels. And all I would point out is, for some reason, half my sentence is missing there. Let me see if... Well, the first part says that we're supposed to be worried about being aggressive in providing more equitable distribution of Earth's resources, which we've learned already from the scriptures we looked at. One important and very interesting concern is that family comes first. And some of this is just sort of a basic Mormon tendency to be overwhelmed by our duties in the church, which are many. And raising a family is no small matter. So I have had friends who say, that sounds great, I'd love to care about the earth, but I don't have the time. So there's sort of a time issue. There's also sort of this feeling of, if I had to give priority to something, it would be to my children, it would be to my family relationships. It's not to rainforest in South America. All I would suggest to you is that it's important to recognize, first of all, what it says in Malachi is that the hearts of the children are supposed to be turned to the fathers, which we understand to be genealogy work, but the hearts of the fathers are supposed to be turned to the children. You and I should be learning how to live, not just for our children, but for our children's children, for our children's children's children, and so on, right? That we have to be thinking in terms of the long term, and much of the lectures you've seen over the course of this semester have projected time into the next 50 to 100 years, and we're just not used to thinking like that, right? In terms of ethics, we normally think of ethics in very, very short term frames, but to think in terms of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 generations in advance of our own lives is what we're now asked to do. And I think it makes sense to think about family in that sense. It also is important to remember, going back to those billion-plus people who are in poverty, we know, and church leaders have preached this over and over again, it is very hard for people to live the gospel when they're hungry. It is very hard for families to have good family structure and to raise good children when they are desperate for to hold on to their livelihood. Hundreds of millions of people are at or below sea level or in floodplains in areas that are vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And they are going to be climate refugees, and many already are becoming climate refugees. So when we think about family, let's remember we're talking about everyone's family and not just our own, and the communities of families that exist all over the world who are extremely vulnerable. And Catherine Hayhoe made that point, that the poor really are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So let's think about those whose livelihoods are in danger. Now, the other objection is people come first. And you hear in the scriptures that we just read, God is saying repeatedly, I created this for you. This is all for you. It's for you to use. And so the tendency is to say, hey, I'm with the logger. I'm not with the spotted owl, right? I mean, if push comes to shove, I'm just going to go with people. And all I would say to that is there's certainly no reason to believe that Mormon theology isn't human-centered. It certainly is. But it is, I think, a false opposition to say, or these are mutually exclusive choices. The scriptures make it clear that we should be concerned for the whole of creation, and the absurdity of that kind of logic is we are willing to foul our own nest. We're willing to say, I'm going to protect people first, so much so that I'm willing to pollute the air and degrade the environment to make it unhealthy for us to be humans on this planet, right? And to make this an unwelcome home for us. So if we are, in fact, really concerned about people first, then we can actually motivate ourselves to care about our survival and our well-being over the long term. And this is a phrase that comes from the great book by Voltaire, the French philosopher, called Candide, in which a character believes that everything that happens is the best of all possible worlds. And so we do have a tendency to be very optimistic for good reason, because we trust in a loving God, that things are always going to work out for the best in the end. But that tends to lead us sometimes to falsely assume that we shouldn't concern ourselves for bad things that we see happening, that somehow these bad things are supposed to happen, so why would we want to stop them if they're supposed to happen? And maybe you've thought that kind of logic before, you've heard people talking like that. The thing that I find that Voltaire was pointing out in his famous book was that this is basically an excuse to watch people be slaughtered in front of you and just sort of say, it'll work out, right? I mean, that's maybe an extreme way to think about it, but when we see evil, our response is and injustice and suffering, our response is to be one of compassion, of service, and of a helping hand, not to be indifferent. And so I think it's important to, somehow my thing got all messed up today. How did that happen? There's supposed to be a red line under the best of all possible worlds, and my point is simply to say that our response is to react ethically to bad things that happen. Freedom is often cited as a reason to worry about to not worry about the environment. In other words, and Catherine Hayhoe mentioned this is a sticking point for a lot of the political differences in our country right now, that many environmental problems seem to require large-scale solutions, and large-scale solutions means large government, and large government means freedom is impinged, right? It means that we're endangering freedom. And I certainly would not be one to give free license to any government program to solve anything, right? I don't believe, and I don't actually know any liberals who truly believe that any government problem is a good one, right? Is better than none. I think we all have to measure large-scale solutions carefully. But one thing that's important to remember is that the system of life that we're already a part of and the economy that we're already in is already threatening our freedom in some very significant ways. Years ago, you and I were not able to be free to know, because, well, let me back up. What enhances freedom is information, is knowledge. And when people were smoking 60 years ago and didn't know that smoking caused cancer, they were much more free to make better choices when they became aware of that information, and when cigarette companies were obligated to say, this might kill you. And you and I now have nutrition labels on all kinds of foods, and we have other kinds of regulations that help us to understand what it is that we're putting into our bodies. So an environmentally minded culture and policy can be effective in helping us to make better informed choices, which I think liberates us in some important ways, rather than being victims of systems of profiteering that are engineered to hide the costs of the products that you and I are consuming. So I think it's important to think about that. So let's think about what a Mormon is to do about all this. And I want to end on a handful of suggestions. The first is to be anxiously engaged in a good cause, which you recognize from D&C Section 58. We are not commanded to wait, or we're not supposed to wait to be commanded to do something, but we are supposed to be anxiously engaged in a good cause. So some people will say, well, when the church tells me I'm supposed to do this, I'll start caring. There was a genocide, there have been genocides in Africa. I don't remember the church saying that I should care, but I can't imagine any of us would say that means that we shouldn't, right? So there are lots of things that we should be caring about that the church isn't giving us explicit instructions on, and that never should mean that we are not supposed to care or that the problem doesn't exist. But by being anxiously engaged, I want to suggest to you that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It can be overwhelming to think about the problems that you've been introduced to this semester and feel almost choked by how overwhelming those problems are, how complex they are, how big they are, how unlikely it is that you are ever going to make any difference at all. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are already lots of organizations and people who are engaged in this, and you can join those efforts. And I have been involved in some interfaith efforts and have just nothing but positive experiences that have resulted from that. Elder Cook said we should both participate ourselves and support people of character and integrity to help reestablish moral values that will bless the entire community. Let me be clear that all voices need to be heard in the public square. Neither religious nor secular voices should be silenced. And you should not be surprised, I'm going to skip ahead here, but you should not be surprised to know that there are many religious organizations that are raising a voice of concern about the environment out of religious concern. And so when I was in college, how many years, 30 years ago now, I had the impression that environmentalism was like for seculars and that religious people didn't pay any attention to it. And I was wrong then, and it would be wrong now to come to that conclusion. Increasingly, actually, the environment is a religious movement and something that religious communities are concerned about. I'm a part of, and many in this room are a part of LDS Earth Stewardship, which is we have a blog, a Facebook page, and we have events and activities that I encourage you to be involved in. We would love to have your involvement. I'm also involved with Utah Interfaith Power and Light, which is the state chapter of the national organization I mentioned that is fighting climate change through faith communities and their efforts to green their practices, green their buildings, and advocate for good and sound policy related to the environment. It's a great experience to be involved civically. So get involved, be engaged in a good cause. Be informed. It's a dangerous thing to be really zealous without a lot of understanding. So, and maybe you feel that that's the least of your problems. Like maybe you feel like I'd get more involved if I really had more confidence in my position about climate change, or if I could understand things better and answer my uncle at Thanksgiving dinner or whatever it is. And all I would say is make it a lifelong commitment, starting right now if you haven't done this already, that you are going to educate yourself, that you're going to be ecologically literate. It doesn't matter what your major is. It doesn't matter your stage of life. If you just make a commitment that you're going to read a little here and there, you're going to read the newspapers, you're going to read Scientific American, you're going to read the National Geographic, you're going to find reliable sources, and you're going to steadily chip away and get more and more understanding. There are tons of books written for lay people about science. There are lots of great books about climate change that are available, lots of great websites. And so you should just understand, the second point I'm making there is don't be afraid to be corrected. All that means is your current understanding is gonna morph and evolve over time, and you should welcome that, right? You should welcome the chance to learn more rather than get dogmatic in your position, which is actually a position of ignorance. That's a dangerous thing to do. So just make it a commitment. And I would say read your news, don't watch it, right? I just think, and avoid any venue that is exclusively partisan. I mean, it's not a bad idea to occasionally check in and say, okay, what are the people on the right saying? What are the people on the left saying? But the bottom line is I think you have to find information that you read, because generally speaking, reading is a little more detailed, it's a little more factual, it's a little less vulnerable to the soundbite and to the attraction of sensation that sometimes happens with news media that is visual. That's not to say you can't learn good things from watching news, but I think it's always best to have a habit of reading a paper or two every single day. Make it your breakfast reading, whatever it takes. And I tend to, this is a great quote from Brigham Young, who basically says it is the duty of the Latter-day Saints, according to Revelations, to give their children the best educations that can be procured, both from the books of the world and the revelations of the Lord. He tells us to study the formations of the earth, to gain the advantages of a scientific education. Apparently, Elder Nelson just gave a beautiful dedication of the Life Sciences building, celebrating the harmony between the gospel and the sciences. So it should be exciting, an exciting adventure for you. And I say that because I'm not a scientist, and I have devoted at least the last 10 or 12 years to reading science, and I feel like a kid in a toy store. It's very exciting for me to learn new facts. It's very exciting for me to talk to scientists and be educated a little bit more. National Academy of Sciences is what I consider. I don't know if the scientists here today would agree, but I find this a very helpful website. This is their website devoted to climate change in particular. And there's a video, there's online publications. They also have publications in print, but it's a good place to go to get reliable information about climate science. Develop a sense of place, and by that I mean you need to really know where you live. You need to care about its natural history and its human history. You are going to move on average every 5 to 7 years, but you should live in every place that you live as if you're going to stay there for the rest of your life. And you will be a good citizen of that place as a result. You'll be more likely to vote and to live in such a way that is conducive to good treatment of that place if you know something about its qualities, if you know what makes it vulnerable, if you know what makes it beautiful, if you know what makes it unique. Catherine Hayhoe mentioned the importance of measuring your own impact. It's gonna depress you when you do that, and that's probably a good thing. I just don't want you to despair. I think it's important to measure your impact, and this is one way to do it. This is a website called Redefining Progress, which is a great, has a online quiz that you can fill out, and you can figure out what your footprint is, and then you can experiment with, okay, if I traveled this many fewer miles per year, what difference would it make? If I put up one of my children for adoption, what difference would it make? No, I'm just kidding. But you can measure your lifestyle and your habits, and my daughter's in the audience, so that probably scared her. But you can measure your impact on the environment in very direct ways, and I think it's very sobering and very helpful to do that. And I sort of do it about every 6 months just to sort of check in and get depressed, and then make a commitment to try to do a little bit better. But it really boils down to energy use, transportation, food, and consumption of goods and services, and how we recreate, how we entertain ourselves. Those are all key, sort of where the rubber meets the road kind of categories that everyone needs to be thinking about. The last thing is to get political but stay civil. The sad truth is that you and I are going to make very little difference by just making some commitments to walk to work or to live close to work or to eat locally. All of those things matter. I think they give us integrity. I think they energize us. They spread an example. They inspire other people. But most of the problems we're facing are so big that they are going to require some pretty large-scale policy decisions that are going to have to happen by people in positions of leadership. So one thing is to be in a position of leadership. So if you're thinking, and this could be, I'm not just talking about politics, but in business and education, in the arts, in government, in economics, in civic planning. Regardless of what you do, you can be involved in your local city government, city council, school board, so on and so forth. And any of those positions of influence have opportunities to influence the earth for the better in the way we treat it. So it's important that we engage in those things, and we don't do this in a partisan way. We don't do it in a vitriolic way, that we treat people with dignity. I will say that if you start to speak out and speak up, you will find that some people will come after you. You will be misunderstood. You will occasionally be maligned. I'm speaking from personal experience, or accused of intentions you would never even dream of. And some people will never, ever leave you alone. You will encounter rabid anger and irrationality, but you must persist, and you must find solidarity with others and move forward in faith and in trust and confidence and charity towards all. And I'm just going to end on this point. I'm sorry I've gone a little bit longer than I intended, but I want to say one final thing about keeping your perspective but not losing your focus. Trying to save or heal or mitigate or whatever it is we try to do in environmentalism is not more important than trying to save souls, your own or others. Our responsibilities to God and to each other do not change because of our degradation of the earth. So nothing you have learned this semester should change your fundamental obligations to your spiritual health. And I unfortunately have seen people who've cared more about environmental stewardship than their own spiritual health. But hopefully it changes your understanding of how much more spiritually healthy you can be if you will extend the meaning of stewardship to include all of life. In other words, I think it's a false understanding to imagine that caring for the earth and caring for human beings are somehow mutually exclusive choices, or even choices that have to be prioritized. If I ask you, how many of you identify yourselves as environmentalists, maybe not all of you would raise your hands. And perhaps the reasons for your hesitation have something to do with the fact that you know you care a lot about other things too, and therefore you imagine that an environmentalist is someone who puts the earth above all other things. And I want to convince you that this is the wrong way to think about it. Because if I asked you how many of you consider yourselves to be stewards, there is no one here that should hesitate to identify yourself as such. If we are all stewards, and we're stewards of the earth as well as of our own bodies, then the question to pose to yourself is, how do my daily routines and my daily choices and my outlook and my voting reflect on and enact that stewardship? How well are we doing at understanding and showing gratitude for the grace of God that has made life possible on this planet and in these bodies of ours, and who sustains our life and our breath at present according to his will? I'm paraphrasing King Benjamin there, but this is a lot to ask. And of course, as King Benjamin tells us, we will sense our own nothingness and the immensity and almost the impossibility of the task. But this kind of inspiration of profound humility and a sense of our inadequacy is a good thing if we remember to have faith and trust in God and a willingness to rethink and re-examine ourselves. It might sound counterintuitive, but what interests me anyway in caring for the environment, more than nature's protection per se, is that we humans learn to live with a more careful, deliberate, and chastened sense of life's beauty and holiness, and that we understand life as a gift. I believe that better care for the world results from more awareness of the miracle of life and our life and the lives of everyone and everything around us. In other words, the steward's life is a consecrated life, and a consecrated life is an integrated one, not a prioritized one that extends spiritual understanding into every aspect of life. I simply can't make sense of how a consecrated life is possible without a profound understanding and appreciation for the gifts of creation. Ultimately, I'm less interested in a world of, say, more recycling and more clean energy and more sustainable practices, as appealing and as important as those things are. I don't want others to join me in some kind of specialized interest group that focuses on the environment. This has nothing at all to do with specialized political pet projects. I want companionship in being astonished at being alive. I want a world that is less automatic, less objectified, less predictable, and more wonderful, surprising, and awesome. And it is a paradox, but I think what I want in this more careful attention to physical life that we're supposed to have is a more spiritual existence, which is to say that what motivates me is religious in its character. Now, the word religion has many connotations, many of them negative in today's society, but its root meanings include acts that bind all things together, that imagine the world as one, and that revisit and reread for greater understanding. In this sense, it has echoes with the meaning of repentance, a turning around, a turning back, and a resetting of things in their proper order. It also has echoes with the word recreation or recreation, which is a remaking of the world, a going back in body and in mind to an imagined moment of creation, as if the world could always be new again and again. In the face of a world that changes with each breeze and each shift in season and each death and each birth, and that grows increasingly warmer, and in light of our life in bodies that exchange matter daily and that transform their cellular makeup many times over in the course of a lifetime, and that absorb and suffer pollution and toxicity, We can scarcely claim to be truly alive if we fail to participate more consciously and more reverently in this ongoing exchange and creation of the world. Such reverence is not the fruit of some specialized form of thinking or some partisan platform, but of a concerted and steady practice of re-examining the whole of our lives in the context of all of creation. This last image is the sacred grove, and it is the chosen place where God the Father and Jesus Christ decided to visit the earth in our dispensation. This grove began its decline as a forest almost as soon as the first vision had taken place. 19th century, the main source of fuel were trees. But now, through our own acts of repentance, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, out of respect for the gifts of the gospel, have restored this forest. We have brought new health to the gifts of this corner of the earth. So this restoration for me is a reminder that we can honor the restoration of the gospel by working to mend our relationship to the earth. An adequate response to climate change doesn't require anything new, just something better. An adequate response looks a lot like a deeply Christian life that shows respect for all of creation, that works to allow all of life to flourish, and that is committed to tread lightly on this great planet that in our theology, as Elder Nash reminds us, we are hoping to be worthy enough to make our eternal home. Thank you very much.